In 2016, the city of Mosul in northern Iraq became the focal point of one of the most intense urban battles of the 21st century. The city, held by ISIS for nearly 2 years, was a symbol of the terror group's self-proclaimed caliphate. But in October 2016, the Iraqi military, supported by international forces, launched a daring operation to retake Mosul. An operation that will go down in history as one of the toughest urban warfare campaigns ever fought. This is the story of the Battle of Mosul, its brutal fighting, its high stakes, and the incredible cost of reclaiming the city. To understand Mosul's importance, we need to look back at the rise of ISIS. By 2014, ISIS has swept across vast swathes of Iraq and Syria, using brutal tactics to seize territory and impose their radical vision of governance. Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, fell to ISIS in June 2014, and the group made it a stronghold. For the next 2 years, the city endured a reign of terror, with civilians trapped under ISIS control, facing violence, forced conversions, and systematic oppression. But by late 2016, the tide was beginning to turn. The Iraqi government, with support from the US-led coalition, began preparing to launch a full-scale offensive to free Mosul from ISIS control. The battle will not just be for a city, it will be for the future of Iraq. The operation to retake Mosul was a massive multinational effort. The Iraqi forces, led by Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, coordinated with Kurdish Peshmerga fighters, Shia militia groups, and international coalitions including the United States. General Joseph Votel, head of US Central Command, played a key role in organizing air support and artillery, while the Iraqi military commander, Lieutenant General Abdel Amir Yarala, spearheaded the ground assault. ISIS was led by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who had declared himself the Caliph of the self-proclaimed Islamic State. Although Baghdadi's influence remained over the city, the group's military leadership was fragmented and their resources were stretched thin as the siege began. The battle began on October 17, 2016, with Iraqi forces advancing on the outskirts of Mosul. But this wasn't going to be a quick victory. The terrain of Mosul, dense urban areas, narrow streets, and heavily fortified buildings played right into ISIS' hands. They turned the city into a maze of traps using sniper positions, car bombs, and suicide attacks to slow the advancing forces. The Iraqi military, alongside Kurdish and international forces, faced staggering challenges. They had to clear house by house, block by block, against an enemy that knew the city intimately and was willing to die for it. ISIS fighters even used civilians as human shields, making it impossible for the coalition to differentiate between fighters and non-combatants. At times, ISIS used sophisticated tactics, including drones to target advancing troops and sniper teams strategically placed throughout the city. The battle stretched on for months, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The Battle of Mosul wasn't just a military confrontation. It was symbolic. For ISIS, losing Mosul meant the end of their caliphate in Iraq. For the Iraqi government and its allies, retaking Mosul was a critical step in defeating ISIS and restoring Iraqi sovereignty. The battle also drew international attention to the human cost of the conflict. Thousands of civilians were caught in the crossfire, with estimates of over 9,000 civilians killed and hundreds of thousands displaced. The toll on the city itself was catastrophic, with large parts of Mosul reduced to rubble. By July 2017, after 9 months of brutal fighting, Mosul was officially declared liberated from ISIS control. However, the victory came at an enormous cost. The city was left devastated and the rebuilding process will take years. Many of the fighters who had taken part in the battle had lost friends, family, and homes, and the scars of the conflict remain today. In the end, the Battle of Mosul marked a decisive turning point in the fight against ISIS, but it also highlighted the complex and high-stake nature of modern warfare in urban environments. The battle was a testament to the resilience of the Iraqi people and the sacrifice made by all those who fought for the city's freedom. Mosul's story is far from over. As the city continues to recover from the devastation of war, it stands as a symbol of resistance, hope, and the resilience of its people. The Battle of Mosul may be over, but the city's journey towards healing and rebuilding continues. In 1097, thousands of crusaders marched east towards Jerusalem, convinced God was on their side. They had already crossed Anatolia, survived starvations, and defeated Seljuk armies, but one city stood in their way: Antioch. Massive walls, towering gates, and one of the strongest fortresses in the Middle East. What followed was not just a siege, but one of the most desperate, chaotic, and brutal episodes of the First Crusade. The siege of Antioch will push the Crusaders to the brink of collapse and change the course of the Crusade forever. The First Crusade began in 1096 after Pope Urban II called on Western Christians to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim control. By late 1097, the Crusader armies made up of French, Norman, German, and Italian nobles had reached northern Syria. Antioch was their next target. The city was strategically vital. It controlled access to the road south towards Jerusalem and was a major political and military center. Antioch was ruled by Yagisyan, a Seljuk governor who knew the Crusaders were coming and prepared for a long defense. The Crusaders, confident after earlier victories, believed Antioch would fall quickly. They were wrong. On the Crusader side were powerful leaders: Bohemond of Taranto, a cunning Norman commander; Raymond of Toulouse, wealthy and deeply religious; Godfrey of Bouillon, respected and disciplined. Inside Antioch, Yagisyan commanded the garrison, supported by the city's massive fortifications and awaiting reinforcement from Muslim allies. Both sides understood one thing clearly: whoever controlled Antioch will control the fate of the crusade. The siege began in October 1097. Antioch's walls were enormous, over 400 towers, making a direct assault nearly impossible. The Crusaders surrounded the city but lacked enough men to fully encircle it. Supplies ran low almost immediately. Winter arrived. Food shortages turned into starvation. Horses were eaten, desertion became common, disease spread through the camps. At times, Crusaders were so weak they could barely stand. Meanwhile, Muslim relief armies repeatedly threatened the siege, forcing the Crusaders to fight while starving. After 7 brutal months, Bohemond made a secret deal with an Armenian guard inside the city. In June 1098, Crusaders climbed the walls at night and opened the gates. Antioch fell, but victory turned to terror almost instantly. Just days later, a massive Muslim army under Kervoga of Mosul arrived and besieged the Crusaders inside the city they had just captured. Now it was the Crusaders who were trapped. Morale collapsed until a peasant named Peter Bartholomew claimed to discover the Holy Lands, the spear said to have pierced Christ. whether real or not, it reignited the Crusader faith. Against overwhelming odds, the Crusaders launched a desperate attack. Amazingly, Kerboga's coalition fractured and his army retreated. The Crusaders had survived the impossible. Antioch became a Crusader stronghold, and Bohemond claimed it as his own principality. The siege of Antioch cost tens of thousands of lives. Through battle, famine, and disease. It delayed the crusade by nearly a year and permanently divided Crusader leadership. But it also proved something crucial. Despite starvation, betrayal, and overwhelming odds, the Crusaders could still win. In 1099, they will march south and capture Jerusalem. Yet, Antioch remained a warning that the crusade will not be a holy march of glory, but a brutal struggle for survival. In the summer of 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte led the largest army Europe had ever seen into Russia. Over 600,000 men marched east, confident that one decisive battle will crush Russian resistance. On September 7, 1812, near a small village called Borodino, Napoleon finally got what he wanted: a massive, bloody confrontation between the French and the Russian armies. The deadliest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. This was the Battle of Borodino, a clash that will decide the fate of Napoleon's invasion. Napoleon invaded Russia after Tsar Alexander I withdrew from the continental system, which was meant to economically isolate Britain. To Napoleon, this was betrayal. As the French advanced, the Russians refused to give battle. Instead, they retreated deeper into the country, burning supplies behind them. A brutal, scorched earth strategy. By early September, Russian commander Mikhail Kutuzov realized that abandoning Moscow without a fight will be politically disastrous. So he chose his ground near the village of Borodino, about 70 miles west of Moscow. Here, the Russians prepared to make their stand. On one side stood Napoleon Bonaparte, still Europe's greatest military mind, commanding around 130,000 troops with over 500 guns. On the other was Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov, leading roughly 120,000 Russian soldiers determined to bleed the French army dry. Napoleon sought a decisive victory. Kutuzov sought survival. Both knew the coming battle would be catastrophic. The Battle of Borodino began at dawn with a thunderous artillery barrage. The Russians had built strong defensive positions, earthworks known as the Fleche, and the heavily fortified Great Redoubt. Wave after wave of French infantry assaulted these positions under murderous cannon fire. The fighting quickly turned into close-range slaughter. Muskets, bayonets, smoke, and confusion filled the battlefield. Entire units were wiped out trying to capture a few hundred meters of ground. Napoleon eventually committed his elite troops, but hesitated to deploy his Imperial Guard, his last reserve. By late afternoon, the French captured the Russian defenses, including the Great Redoubt. But the Russian army did not collapse. As night fell, both sides were exhausted, surrounded by tens of thousands of dead and wounded. Borodino ended without a clear tactical victor. Borodino was one of the bloodiest battles of the 19th century. Over 70,000 men were killed or wounded in a single day. Although Napoleon technically held the battlefield, the Russian army remained intact and retreated in good order. Napoleon had won, but at a terrible cost. He had failed to destroy the Russian army, which was his real objective. A week later, Napoleon entered Moscow, only to find it abandoned and burning. With no Russian surrender and winter approaching, the occupation became a trap. The disastrous retreat from Russia soon followed, destroying the Grand Army. Borodino marked the turning point. It showed that Napoleon could be stopped and that even victory could lead to ruin. The road to his downfall began here, on the blood-soaked fields of Borodino. For over a century, the island of Crete was a nightmare for the Byzantine Empire. From its fortified capital, Candax, Muslim pirates raided the coast of Greece, enslaved thousands, and threatened Constantinople's sea lanes. By the mid-10th century, the Byzantines had tried and failed multiple times to retake the island. But in 960, the empire made one final massive attempt. This time, they sent their best general, and after 8 brutal months, the fate of Crete will be decided. Crete had fallen to Muslim Andalusian exiles in the early 9th century, who established the Emirate of Crete. From Candax, modern Heraklion, they launched constant pirate raids across the Aegean. Entire coastal regions were devastated, monasteries destroyed, and trade disrupted. For Byzantium, Crete was a dagger pointed at the heart of the empire. Previous reconquest attempts had ended in disaster, but by 960, the Byzantine military was stronger than it had been in centuries. The emperor, Romanus II, decided the time had finally come. The man chosen for the mission was Nikephoros Phokas, a brilliant, ruthless general from one of Byzantium's most powerful military families. Phokas assembled a massive expedition. Over 300 ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, siege engines, engineers, and elite troops. Defending Candax was the Emir Abd al-Aziz, relying on thick walls, deep moats, and the city's reputation as unconquerable. Neither side expected a quick fight. In the summer of 960, the Byzantine fleet landed on Crete and marched straight for Candax. The city was heavily fortified, high stone walls, reinforced towers, and a deep defensive trench. Initial Byzantine assaults failed, so Phokas settled in for a long siege. The Byzantines surrounded the city, cutting off supplies by land and sea. Siege engines battered the walls day and night. Inside Candax, food ran low, disease spread, morale collapsed. The defenders launched desperate sorties, but were driven back with heavy losses. After months of stalemate, Phokas ordered a final all-out assault. In March 961, Byzantine troops breached the walls. What followed was savage, close-quarters fighting in the streets. By the end of the day, Candax had fallen. The fall of Candax was a turning point. Crete was finally back in Byzantine hands after 137 years. Muslim piracy in the Aegean collapsed almost overnight. The Byzantine navy regained control of the eastern Mediterranean. And Nikephoros Phokas became the most famous general in the empire, soon to be crowned emperor himself. After the siege, Crete was reorganized as a Byzantine province. The island was repopulated, fortified, and Christianized once again. For the Byzantine Empire, the reconquest of Crete marked the beginning of a new era, one of expansion, confidence, and military revival. The siege of Candax was not just a victory, it was Byzantium announcing that it was back. In 1877, Europe stood on the brink of a major transformation. The Russian Empire had gone to war with the Ottoman Empire, claiming to defend Christian populations in the Balkans and to finally push Ottoman power out of Europe. Most observers expected a quick Russian victory, but in northern Bulgaria, at a small fortified town called Plevna, the war suddenly ground to a halt. There, an Ottoman commander named Osman Pasha shocked the world by stopping one of the largest Russian offensives of the 19th century. This was the Siege of Plevna, a battle that changed modern warfare forever. To understand Plevna, we need to look at the larger war. The Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878 began after uprisings in the Balkans and growing outrage in Europe over Ottoman rule. Russia saw an opportunity to expand its influence and marched south across the Danube, expecting Ottoman resistance to collapse quickly. Early Russian advances were rapid, but the town of Plevna, located at a key road junction in Bulgaria, stood directly in the path of the Russian army. Whoever controlled Plevna controlled access to the Balkans, and the Ottomans were not willing to give it up. Defending Plevna was Osman Pasha, one of the Ottoman Empire's most capable and disciplined commanders. Rather than retreat, Osman immediately fortified the town, digging trenches, redoubts, and defensive earthworks, years ahead of their time. Facing him were Russian forces led by Grand Duke Nicholas, supported later by Romanian troops under Prince Carol of Romania. The Russians believed sheer numbers would overwhelm the Ottomans. Osman Pasha believed preparation and discipline would decide the battle. The fighting at Plevna began with a series of direct Russian assaults. Each attack ended in disaster. Russian troops advanced in dense formations, only to be cut down by modern Ottoman rifles and devastating artillery fire. Osman Pasha's trench system allowed his soldiers to fire, withdraw, and reappear with deadly efficiency. The Russians tried again and again. Each time they suffered massive casualties. By August 1877, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded, while Ottoman losses remained comparatively low. Realizing frontal attacks were hopeless, the Russians changed strategy. They surrounded Plevna completely, cutting off supplies and reinforcements. What began as a battle turned into a brutal siege of starvation. The siege of Plevna was a turning point in military history. It demonstrated that trenches, rifles, and defensive firepower had made hostile frontal assaults obsolete. European armies studied Plevna closely, lessons that would later shape World War I. Politically, Plevna delayed the Russian advance for months, nearly derailing the entire Balkan campaign. And it proved that the Ottoman army, often dismissed as weak, could still fight with skill and determination. By December 1877, Plevna was out of food and ammunition. Osman Pasha made one final breakout attempt, but was wounded and forced to surrender. His defense had lasted 145 days. Although Russia eventually won the war, Plevna had changed everything. Osman Pasha was treated with respect by his enemies and became a hero in the Ottoman world. This siege delayed Russia long enough to reshape post-war negotiations and permanently alter how modern wars would be fought. Plevna was not just a siege, it was the moment the modern battlefield was born.